The roar of applause for Joe Biden's words quickly died as Bernie Sanders delivered a single line that would echo across the country. "You can't fix a broken system with band-aids." It wasn't just a sentence. It was a direct assault on everything Biden had built his career on. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Biden's eyes narrowed, his usual calm now tinged with irritation, but he didn't respond right away. He didn't have to. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a seismic shift in the debate that no one saw coming. The crowd had been swept up in Biden's rhetoric moments before, his usual talk of unity, compromise, and incremental progress. The promises of small steps and practical solutions had seemed so familiar, so comfortable, so safe. But Sanders wasn't here to play it safe. Biden leaned forward, his voice steady, but there was a sharp edge to it now. "Bernie, with all due respect, you're talking about fantasy. You can't tear everything down and rebuild it overnight. That's not how Washington works." But Sanders, unmoved by the blowback, stood tall. His gaze never wavered from Biden. "That's exactly the problem, Joe. The system is broken, and your small steps aren't fixing it. People are dying because you're too afraid to go big." The room was dead silent. The audience, once engaged and applauding Biden's every word, now held their breath. The challenge was undeniable. This wasn't just about politics anymore. This was a showdown. Biden smirked, trying to regain his composure. "And what, Bernie? You think your plan is going to magically solve everything?" But Sanders' voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I don't think. I know." The crowd went quiet. Every eye in the room was locked on them. For a moment, it seemed like time itself had slowed down. What had just happened? Had Sanders really just called out the most powerful man in the room like that? But what happened next would leave the entire country in disbelief. The tension in the room was palpable. It wasn't just another debate. This was the moment when the future of America hung in the balance. Social programs like Medicare for All, universal basic income, and climate action had moved from fringe ideas to national headlines. Millions of Americans, struggling to make ends meet, had been waiting for a leader who would answer their cries. The stakes were clear. On one side, you had Joe Biden, a man who represented the status quo, the pragmatic promise of small, incremental change. On the other, you had Bernie Sanders, a revolutionary figure, a champion for the people who believed that the only way forward was a bold, sweeping overhaul of the system. The country was divided. The tension in the air mirrored the divisions on the ground. Cities across America were witnessing protests, communities were organizing, and every day felt like a battle between old and new. The debate wasn't just over policies, it was over the future of the country itself. Healthcare, an issue that had plagued America for decades, was at the forefront. Sanders' call for Medicare for All was no longer just a talking point. It had become a rallying cry for those tired of fighting with insurance companies, who had watched friends and family struggle to get basic care. For Biden, who had spent his entire career working in the system, his defense of the Affordable Care Act seemed too cautious, too complacent for a country that was hurting. Universal basic income was another flashpoint. A policy Sanders had championed for years, now gaining serious traction as a solution to the growing inequality exacerbated by automation and globalization. Biden, though supportive of social welfare, feared that such an ambitious idea was unrealistic, a pipe dream in the face of a system that wouldn't allow for radical change. And then there was climate change. The planet was burning. Wildfires, hurricanes, floods, every year, the damage seemed more severe, and the urgency greater. Sanders wasn't just talking about addressing climate change, he was demanding a Green New Deal that would transform the entire economy, creating millions of jobs while tackling the existential threat of global warming. Biden, in contrast, pushed for incremental climate action, something that wouldn't threaten the deep ties his campaign had with fossil fuel interests. This was the battlefield. But the country wasn't just divided along political lines, it was divided by the people's very beliefs in what America stood for. Were we a nation of progress, or were we a nation of compromise? Was it our time to build something new and just, or would we continue to let the system prop up the powerful few? The eyes of the nation were fixed on this moment. The debate wasn't just about two men, it was about two futures. And this was the clash of ideologies that would determine which path America would take. The room was silent, waiting for the next move. The tension, thick with anticipation, lingered in the air as Biden and Sanders stood at opposite ends of the stage. Their faces reflected the weight of what they represented, the embodiment of two competing visions of America. What happened next would reshape the political landscape forever. The outcome of this debate, this battle of ideals, would determine whether the country would move toward a future defined by bold change or settle for more of the same. Millions of lives, millions of dreams, were at stake. And the world was watching. Joe Biden had spent his entire political career working the system. He'd built his reputation in the Senate not by pushing radical ideas, but by mastering the art of compromise, cajoling, negotiating, and striking deals with both sides. For decades, Biden had been the epitome of what the political establishment called bipartisanship. He was the man who could make it happen when others said it couldn't, the man who promised to bring people together. But there was a price to that unity, one that, as the years wore on, became increasingly apparent. Born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Biden rose from humble beginnings. His story was one of perseverance and ambition, a testament to the American dream. The son of a car salesman, Biden knew hardship firsthand, having witnessed his father's struggles to keep his family afloat during tough economic times. His early years shaped his vision of what America could be, an America where hard work led to prosperity, where opportunity was available to all. But somewhere along the way, that idealism morphed into a more tempered, calculated vision of what was politically possible. His time in the Senate solidified this pragmatic approach. Over 36 years in Washington, Biden learned how to play the game, how to appease powerful corporate interests, how to stay in the good graces of lobbyists, how to offer just enough to the people without upsetting the delicate balance of the system. His reputation grew not as a crusader for sweeping reforms but as a steady hand who could keep the ship afloat, no matter the storm. He was trusted by corporate donors, endorsed by unions, and supported by a political system that preferred stability over upheaval. But that stability came at a cost, because stability, for Biden, meant maintaining the status quo. When Biden spoke about healthcare reform, it wasn't about Medicare for all or universal coverage, it was about incremental improvements. The Affordable Care Act, which he championed under President Obama, was hailed as a monumental step forward. But in Biden's mind, it wasn't about delivering justice for the millions who had been denied healthcare. It was about making modest changes that would satisfy just enough of the electorate to keep things moving in the right direction. He didn't see a broken system that needed a radical fix, he saw a system that could be patched up, a system that still served powerful interests, from pharmaceutical giants to private insurance companies. His relationship with corporate donors was also a central part of his story. Biden had long been a favorite of Wall Street, the banking industry, and big business. Campaign finance records told the story, millions in donations from industries that had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Biden had been their man for years, a safe bet who could be trusted to make decisions that would not disturb the entrenched power structures. But that loyalty came with consequences, most notably, his reluctance to tackle the issue of wealth inequality head-on. While Biden occasionally acknowledged the widening gap between the rich and the poor, his solutions were never radical. He advocated for raising the minimum wage, improving access to education, and expanding the middle class, but those were modest fixes. He rarely addressed the true systemic nature of wealth inequality, how it was woven into the very fabric of the capitalist system. Instead, Biden's approach was to work within that system, to patch up its flaws and offer a little more to the working class, while never fundamentally altering the power dynamics that kept the rich on top. It was these contradictions that made Biden anathema to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and by extension, a villain in the eyes of Bernie Sanders and his supporters. Biden was a symbol of everything that needed to be changed: the complacency, the corporate influence, the refusal to challenge the status quo. To the left, Biden's brand of politics was an excuse to do just enough to maintain appearances, but never enough to actually shift the balance of power. Biden's brand of compromise wasn't about finding common ground, it was about maintaining the system, even if that meant leaving millions behind. The political system, as Biden saw it, was not something to be broken and rebuilt, it was something to be worked with. His centrist approach was grounded in the belief that progress could only come in small, incremental steps. But with each step, he had only moved the needle slightly, never confronting the deeper, structural issues that held the country back. In Biden's world, there were no revolutionaries, only negotiators. The voices of those demanding radical change, like Sanders, were seen as idealistic and unrealistic, voices that threatened the careful balance Biden had spent his career preserving. This was the world Biden had built, a world of compromise, but also a world that had left too many behind. It was a world where the powerful remained powerful, where the system was allowed to continue as it was, unchallenged and unaccountable. And now, in a moment that could change the entire course of American history, that system was being directly challenged by Bernie Sanders, a man who saw things differently. What Biden couldn't understand, what he refused to see, was that the system he fought to preserve had failed. The American people were demanding more, and they weren't going to wait for Biden's slow, methodical approach any longer. They were looking for someone who would tear it down and rebuild it from the ground up. And Bernie Sanders was the one who was ready to lead that charge. The time for compromise was over. But Biden wasn't ready to admit it yet. Bernie Sanders' story was never one of comfort or privilege. He didn't come from the halls of elite universities or inherit a political dynasty. He came from the working-class streets of Brooklyn, New York, a place where dreams were often overshadowed by struggle. Raised by Jewish immigrant parents who lived paycheck to paycheck, Sanders understood the weight of financial insecurity. His father, a modest laborer, never made much, but he taught Bernie the value of hard work, dignity, and, most importantly, fairness. In the heart of Brooklyn, Sanders learned early on that life wasn't fair. The wealth inequality was glaring, the lack of opportunity suffocating. His family's struggles became his own motivation. He wasn't just a boy growing up in a city, he was a young man who saw firsthand the crushing impact of a system that seemed designed to reward the few at the expense of the many. Sanders wasn't someone born into politics, he was forged by it. As a young man, Sanders went to the University of Chicago, where he became deeply involved in social activism. It was there that he found his voice, fighting for civil rights, against racism, and for economic justice. His commitment to social causes was rooted in the deep injustices he saw around him, but it also became clear that Sanders had a unique vision: the country needed radical change. The institutions that claimed to serve the people had instead become tools for the powerful, the wealthy, and the corporate elite. America, in his eyes, had stopped being a place of opportunity and had turned into a playground for the rich. This belief in systemic reform would guide him for the rest of his life. When Sanders became mayor of Burlington, Vermont, he took his vision for a fairer society into the political sphere. He didn't play by the traditional rules. He didn't make compromises just to get elected or re-elected. Sanders believed in something more: a society where healthcare, education, and a decent living wage were not privileges for the lucky few, but fundamental human rights for all. His time as mayor wasn't about pleasing donors or working with the political establishment, it was about building something real, something that served the people. He implemented progressive policies, expanded housing programs, and fought for workers' rights. People saw a politician who wasn't afraid to make enemies because he knew who his real allies were: the people. It was this unyielding stance on economic justice that propelled him into the national spotlight. When Sanders ran for the U.S. Senate, he ran on the same principles: Medicare for all, universal access to education, living wages for every American, and a fair shot at the American dream, no exceptions. But he didn't just talk the talk. Bernie Sanders had spent decades in the trenches, fighting for working-class people and challenging a system that was rigged in favor of the wealthy elite. His message resonated with millions across the country, particularly as people saw the cracks in the system widening, healthcare premiums skyrocketing, wages stagnating, and the rich growing wealthier by the day. Sanders didn't just call for reform, he called for revolution, radical systemic change. He didn't believe in tinkering at the edges of a broken system. He believed that the system itself had to be torn down and rebuilt. His advocacy for Medicare for All wasn't about tweaking the Affordable Care Act, it was about ensuring that every person, regardless of income, had access to the healthcare they needed. His support for a Green New Deal wasn't a pie-in-the-sky dream, it was a blueprint for transforming the American economy to fight climate change while creating millions of good-paying jobs. For Sanders, the solutions to America's problems weren't about compromises, they were about bold, sweeping action. And in that, Sanders became a champion of the people. He was the voice of the voiceless. When he spoke about income inequality, he didn't just rattle off statistics, he spoke from the heart. He spoke about real people who were working 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, about children who went to bed hungry, about families who couldn't afford healthcare. His campaign wasn't about appeasing corporate donors or political elites, it was about empowering the people. And that was why Sanders' message resonated so deeply, because it wasn't about politics, it was about justice. But it wasn't just about economic policy, it was about dignity. Bernie Sanders wasn't just fighting for economic reforms, he was fighting for human dignity. He believed that every person deserved respect, that every worker deserved a living wage, that no one should be forced to choose between their health and their livelihood. For Sanders, this wasn't about political ideology, it was about the moral imperative to create a fairer, more just society. And this belief in dignity and fairness was what separated him from Joe Biden. While Biden may have prided himself on his pragmatism and his ability to work within the system, Sanders refused to accept the status quo. Sanders wasn't afraid to speak uncomfortable truths, even if it meant alienating powerful political figures or corporate donors. He wasn't here to make deals with the establishment, he was here to dismantle it, piece by piece. The contrast was stark. Biden represented compromise, working within the system. Sanders represented revolution, a fight to radically transform the system that had failed too many for far too long. The divide between them wasn't just about policy, it was about values. Biden, the consummate insider, was terrified of upsetting the delicate balance of power. Sanders, the outsider, was willing to fight for a future where dignity, equality, and justice could finally be realized for all. Biden's vision was incremental, Sanders was sweeping. Biden's was about managing the system, Sanders was about dismantling it. For Bernie Sanders, the fight wasn't just political, it was personal. His entire life had been spent in service of the idea that America could be better. And this moment, this clash with Biden, was the culmination of everything he had fought for. This wasn't just a debate over policies, it was a battle over America's soul. The tension in the room was thick. What had begun as a civil exchange was now rapidly spiraling into a full-blown confrontation. Biden, ever the seasoned politician, tried to regain control, his voice cutting through the rising murmur of discontent in the audience. Bernie, we can't simply throw out everything and start over. What you're proposing, Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, universal basic income, these are pipe dreams. Wishful thinking, Biden said, his tone trying to exude calm but betraying a thin layer of frustration. This is not how politics works. It's not how you govern. You can't just wave a magic wand and make everything better. You need to be realistic. But Bernie Sanders wasn't backing down. His eyes locked with Biden's, unwavering, unflinching. There was a fire in him now, a righteous anger that had been building for decades. He wasn't here to play the political game. He was here to fight for the millions who had been ignored for far too long. Wishful thinking. Sanders shot back, his voice rising, carrying the weight of truth. What's wishful thinking, Joe, is believing that the system we've built over the last 40 years is going to fix itself. What's wishful thinking is thinking that more of the same is going to solve anything. Biden's jaw tightened. He had spent a career working within the very system Sanders was attacking. His approach had always been to make slow, steady progress, to strike deals, to win favor from the establishment. But Sanders was relentless, tearing down every defense Biden tried to build. Look at the facts. Sanders continued, his voice unwavering. The middle class is shrinking, wages are stagnating, and people are drowning in healthcare costs. Families are choosing between groceries and medicine. And what do we get from Washington? More empty promises, more compromises that leave people behind. This system is rigged, Joe, and you know it. The crowd was starting to murmur, a ripple of agreement spreading through the room. They weren't just hearing numbers and policies, they were hearing their own pain, their own struggles reflected in Sanders' words. The people were finally seeing a man who was willing to speak the uncomfortable truth, a man who refused to ignore the growing chasm between the haves and the have-nots. Biden could feel the shift in the room. His calm, calculated demeanor was starting to crack. He had spent his career listening to the same voices, the powerful, the elites, making deals, building coalitions. Now, in front of him, Sanders was tapping into something deeper, something more visceral. The people were no longer looking for compromise, they were looking for change. And that scared Biden. "Bernie, this isn't about making speeches," Biden countered, trying to steady his tone. "This is about what's possible. You think I don't want change? But we've got to work with what we have, not burn it all down. You can't just tear up the rulebook because you don't like the game. That's not how you get things done." But Sanders was on a roll now, unstoppable. "No, Joe," he replied, his voice firm and cutting. "What's impossible is thinking that a broken system can be fixed by the same people who broke it. You think healthcare is affordable? Ask the millions of Americans who can't afford their prescriptions, or the families who face bankruptcy because they got sick. You think the Green New Deal is too ambitious? It's not ambitious enough. We're running out of time to fix the climate crisis. And you think it's unrealistic to give people a living wage? People are dying, Joe. They're suffering right now. And you think small steps are going to fix that?" The room was silent now. The weight of Sanders' words hung in the air. This wasn't just a debate about policy anymore, it was a debate about values. Biden, the veteran politician, representing the establishment and the slow, careful approach to change, was now visibly rattled. Sanders wasn't just challenging him on the facts, he was challenging everything Biden stood for. Biden shifted in his seat, his face growing taut. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered on his lips. This wasn't how he had planned the night to go. He was used to playing the game, working the angles, finding the middle ground. But Sanders wasn't looking for the middle ground, he was demanding a new America. A better America. "You're a decent man, Joe," Sanders said, his voice softening for a moment, but still resolute. "But we've been playing your game for decades. And where has it gotten us? The rich keep getting richer, the corporations keep getting stronger, and the people keep getting left behind. You want to fix the system? Well, you can't fix it without breaking it first." For a moment, there was no response. Biden's eyes flicked to the crowd, trying to gauge their reaction, but it was too late. The shift had already happened. Sanders had become the voice of the people, the voice that spoke not just of policy but of their suffering, their frustration, their hope for something better. And Biden, for all his experience and political savvy, was beginning to look like a man clinging to a system that no longer worked. The tension between them was palpable. The debate had moved from policy differences to a battle of ideals. Biden, the man who wanted to maintain the status quo, was now facing down a man who refused to accept anything less than a complete transformation of the system. It was clear, one of them would have to give. And in that moment, it wasn't just about winning a debate, it was about deciding the future of America itself. But what happened next would push the debate past its breaking point. The room was thick with anticipation. Biden shifted uneasily in his seat, his hands resting on the podium as he took a slow breath, clearly trying to regroup. Sanders could see it, the cracks forming in Biden's confident exterior. He had spent years selling the idea that small steps were the answer, that gradual change could make the system work for everyone. But Sanders wasn't buying it. The truth was too clear. It was time for him to speak the truth, the one that Biden, for all his experience, had failed to acknowledge. "I've heard enough, Joe," Sanders said, his voice suddenly sharp and clear, carrying through the room like a clarion call. "You talk about compromise. You talk about moderation. But the people who are hurting, the people who need real change, they don't have the luxury of time. They don't have the luxury of waiting for incremental progress. You want to know why? Because they're dying." The room fell silent. "I've seen it. I've been there." Sanders' voice dropped, becoming more personal, more intimate. The fire in his words burned with a deep, raw truth. "You sit in your office, and you tell yourself that these half measures, these small fixes, are enough. But I've been to the hospitals. I've seen the mothers crying because they can't afford the insulin their children need to stay alive. I've met veterans who can't get the care they've earned, the care they deserve. You can't tell a mother who can't afford health insurance that your half measures are going to save her child. You can't tell people who've lost their jobs, who've lost their homes, that Band-Aids are going to fix their broken lives." There it was. The moment of clarity. The line that cut through the noise and shattered the facade that had built up around Biden's approach. Sanders had spoken not just of policy but of humanity. His words weren't numbers or statistics, they were faces. Lives. His voice trembled with the weight of everything he had seen, everything he had fought for. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the room feel the full impact of his challenge. "The system we have, Joe, isn't just broken. It's built to fail. It's built to keep the powerful in charge, to make sure the wealth keeps flowing to the top, to make sure that the rich can keep getting richer while the poor and working-class people, people like the ones I grew up with, are left to fend for themselves." He stepped forward, locking eyes with Biden, his gaze unwavering. Biden could feel the heat of Sanders' conviction, and for the first time in this debate, his composed exterior began to crack. "You say reform is impossible. You say it can't be done. But the truth is, Joe, reform is only possible when we stop protecting the people who benefit from the system as it is. It's only possible when we have the courage to take on the billionaires, the corporations, the political insiders who've rigged the system for their own gain." The crowd stirred. The weight of Sanders' words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Biden, ever the politician, was still trying to maintain his composure, but his face was flushed now, his usual calm demeanor slipping away. Sanders wasn't done yet. "I didn't come here to tell people that everything will be okay if we just pass a few more bills. I came here to fight for the people who've been ignored, who've been left behind, who've had their lives destroyed by a system that's not built for them. I'm not here to play it safe, Joe. I'm here to fix what's been broken for far too long." Biden opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had nothing left to say. Sanders had spoken the truth, simple, undeniable truth, that he couldn't refute. His defense, the arguments he had spent his entire political career perfecting, were crumbling in front of him. Biden wasn't the only one who had spent decades working in Washington. Sanders had fought just as long, just as hard, but he had never compromised. He had never backed down from what he knew was right. For the first time in the debate, Biden wasn't the calm, experienced statesman, he was the man on the defensive, trying to hold on to his version of reality, a version that was no longer aligned with the needs of the country. Sanders continued, his voice gaining power. "People are dying because they can't get the care they need. People are working themselves to the bone, and they still can't make ends meet. You tell them that things are getting better, but they know it's a lie. They see the rich getting richer while they struggle to pay for basic necessities. They know they're being left behind." The room was electric, the audience now completely captivated. Sanders was no longer just a candidate on stage, He was a voice of the people, a beacon of hope for those who had been pushed to the margins of society. The crowd, once divided, now rallied behind him. They could feel it, the urgency in his words, the righteousness in his fight. "You know why I'm here, Joe?" Sanders leaned in, his voice barely a whisper but carrying a weight that shook the room. "Because every day, there are families, mothers, fathers, children, who are waiting for us to act. They're waiting for us to stop with the small talk, the empty promises, and actually deliver for them. They need healthcare. They need jobs. They need a future. And they're not going to wait for us to figure it out in a decade. They need change now. They need the system to work for them, not for the corporations. And that's why I'm fighting, Joe. I'm fighting for them." The crowd erupted, a standing ovation that echoed through the hall. Sanders had taken his moment, and in doing so, had become not just a politician, but a symbol of everything the people had been waiting for. He was a voice for the voiceless, the man who wasn't afraid to take on the establishment, to take on the powers that be. Biden, still standing behind the podium, was visibly shaken. His shoulders slumped, his expression faltering. He had been outclassed, not in experience, not in knowledge, but in courage. Sanders stood tall, the audience still buzzing with energy, the sound of their applause reverberating through the room. The debate had shifted. It was no longer about compromise or small victories. It was about a vision for the future, one that promised real change, one that would no longer tolerate a system built to protect the few at the expense of the many. The future had just spoken. And it wasn't going to be silenced. Biden knew it. The audience knew it. The country would know it soon enough. The aftermath of Bernie Sanders' devastating rebuttal rippled across the nation like a shockwave, shaking the political landscape to its core. The next morning, as the debate replays across news outlets and social media platforms, the reverberations are undeniable. It didn't take long for the hashtags to appear, #MedicareForAll, #Bernie 2024, #ChangeNow, each one trending at the top of Twitter and Instagram, sparking a wildfire of support and conversation. Within hours, Sanders' words were everywhere. The clip of his mic drop counterattack played on repeat, its emotional power impossible to ignore. "You can't tell people that Band-Aids will fix their broken lives," Sanders had said. That line, with its raw conviction, had struck a chord not just with his supporters but with millions of Americans who had spent years watching the establishment ignore their suffering. Politicians across the country weighed in. Progressive lawmakers, who had long stood behind Sanders, were quick to amplify his message. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted, "Bernie's right. It's time to stop pretending the system is working. #Medicare for all or nothing. The people have spoken." Others in Congress, emboldened by Sanders' powerful message, started calling out Biden for his incremental approach. Representative Ilhan Omar, in a now viral tweet, sharply criticized Biden, "Time to face facts. The people don't want compromise, they want justice." Bernie Sanders gave the country the truth last night. The political pundits couldn't stop talking about the debate. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow framed the night as a turning point in the Democratic race. "What we saw last night was more than just a debate. Bernie Sanders is no longer just a candidate, he's become a movement. His message, his fight for the people, has struck a nerve in a way that will define the future of this party." Across the cable networks, Sanders was being hailed as the embodiment of a new wave of progressivism, a figure who was pushing the boundaries of American politics, refusing to accept the incrementalism that had defined Biden's career. Biden's camp, meanwhile, was on the defensive. The former vice president had weathered storms before, but this was different. The questions began to come fast and furious. Was his moderate stance out of touch with the electorate? Was he still living in the past, unable or unwilling to meet the demands of a new generation that wanted more than just small fixes to America's most pressing problems? In Washington, insiders who had long supported Biden were now quietly second-guessing their allegiances. The whispers in corridors grew louder. Establishment Democrats who once saw Biden as the safe choice were beginning to reconsider. The party was evolving, and Biden, despite his decades of service, looked like a man clinging to outdated ideals in a time when the world was changing faster than ever. But it wasn't just the political world that was reacting. The cultural ramifications were equally profound. Celebrities, influencers, and artists took to social media, too. Actor and activist Mark Ruffalo tweeted, "Bernie Sanders is the leader this country needs." The people spoke loud and clear last night. Hashtag Green New Deal, hashtag Medicare for All. Hollywood powerhouses like Leonardo DiCaprio and Natalie Portman joined the chorus, amplifying Sanders' message to their millions of followers. Late-night hosts, usually known for their comedic takes, weighed in seriously. Jimmy Kimmel opened his show with, "Look, I don't get political often, but last night, Bernie Sanders showed us all why we need a change. Forget safe choices, America deserves better." But it was on the ground, in the streets, where the full impact of Sanders' victory was felt. Across the country, spontaneous rallies and marches broke out. From New York to Los Angeles, people gathered to cheer Sanders on, holding signs emblazoned with the now iconic slogan, "Not me. Us." Sanders had not only won the debate, he had captured the heart of a nation hungry for transformation. Biden's support base, on the other hand, started to fracture. His previous confidence was replaced with visible discomfort. The establishment donors who had supported him for years, those who saw Biden as the safe bet for maintaining the status quo, were now concerned. Biden's moderate platform had seemed like a win a few months ago, but the political climate had shifted. The country, particularly younger generations, was no longer content with slow, incremental progress. They demanded bold action. On Capitol Hill, even Biden's allies began questioning the feasibility of his approach. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who had been a steady Biden supporter, found himself cornered by reporters, fielding questions about the viability of Biden's healthcare plan in the wake of Sanders' fierce push for Medicare for all. "We've got to listen to the people," Schumer said, though his words lacked the usual conviction. "It's clear that there's a lot of support for Bernie's vision. We need to have an honest conversation about where we go from here." In the media, Biden's weaknesses were being magnified. Morning talk shows that had previously praised his steadiness and experience now began to critique his reluctance to embrace the bold change that was so clearly demanded by voters. CNN's Jake Tapper asked, "Can Biden continue to lead when the Democratic base is demanding something more? Is there room for a centrist when the people are calling for revolution?" Even Democratic voters who had once seen Biden as the safe choice were now questioning whether he was the right candidate for a party at a crossroads. Meanwhile, Sanders was becoming more than just a candidate, he was a symbol. A symbol of a movement, a message, and a moment in history. His challenge wasn't just against Biden, it was against a system that had allowed the rich to accumulate power while the rest of the country suffered. Sanders' vision for America was one of transformation, a bold challenge to the entrenched powers that be. And the more people heard his voice, the more they recognized his uncompromising fight for justice. Sanders, once considered a fringe candidate, was now at the center of the conversation. His radical ideas, once dismissed as too far left, were quickly becoming the new norm. Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, universal basic income, these were no longer pipe dreams. They were the future. The debate had marked a turning point, a moment that would be remembered in the history of American politics. Sanders wasn't just a voice in the wilderness anymore. He was the face of change. And as the country looked ahead, it was clear, progress was inevitable. The question wasn't if America would change, it was whether the establishment could keep up. The roar of applause still echoed in Bernie Sanders' ears as the night of the debate came to a close. But it wasn't the cheers of the crowd or the triumph in the moment that lingered. It was the weight of what he had said, the weight of everything that was at stake. He knew that the real work was only beginning. The debate was over, but the fight for America's future was far from finished. Standing at the podium, Sanders turned to face the nation, his voice steady but full of conviction. Last night, we had a choice, he began, his words carrying the same fire that had ignited the debate. We had a choice between the politics of the past and the politics of the future. We had a choice between a system that protects the few and one that works for the many. And now, it's up to us, every single one of us, to decide which path we want to take. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, imagining the millions of people who were listening, hoping, believing that change was finally within reach. America has always been about the pursuit of a better life. For too long, we've allowed a system to operate that puts profits over people. For too long, we've accepted the idea that healthcare, education, and economic opportunity should be privileges, not rights. The room was silent, but the energy in the air was palpable. Sanders' voice cut through the silence, becoming a beacon for those who had been waiting for someone to speak their truth. But we know better now. We know that healthcare is a human right. We know that every child deserves the opportunity to get a quality education. We know that every worker deserves a living wage, not a life of struggle just to survive. This is not some far-off dream, this is the future we can build together. Sanders' words weren't just about policies, they were about values. He wasn't asking for radical change because it was easy. He was asking for it because it was necessary. He was asking for it because the status quo had failed the people who needed it most. And in that moment, he called on everyone to join him in the fight, not just for policies, but for a country that would finally live up to its ideals. I don't need to remind you that the system we have today is broken. I don't need to tell you that millions of Americans are suffering because our priorities are wrong. You've seen it. You've felt it. But I'm here to tell you that we don't have to accept this. We have the power to build a new America, one where justice, dignity, and equality are more than just words we say. They are values we live by. His words rang with the strength of a man who had been fighting for this moment his entire life. Sanders wasn't just asking for change, he was demanding it. Real leadership isn't about making the easy choices. It's about making the right ones. It's about having the courage to challenge the system when it's failing the people, when it's protecting the powerful, when it's ignoring the most vulnerable among us. Real leadership is about standing up for the people, even when the establishment tells you it's too risky, even when they say it can't be done. The room filled with a sense of purpose, a collective belief that something bigger than any individual or any politician was at play. Sanders' fight wasn't just his own, it was the fight of every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or cast aside by the system. It was the fight of every person who had ever dreamed of a better future. You want to know what real progress looks like? Sanders asked, his voice rising with the power of his conviction. It's not about half measures or easy compromises. It's about taking the bold steps necessary to create the society we know is possible. It's about giving every American the dignity they deserve, by ensuring they can get the healthcare they need, by guaranteeing an education that opens doors, by creating an economy that works for all people, not just the rich and powerful. His words resonated deeply, carrying the weight of a moral truth that had been buried beneath years of complacency and fear. This wasn't just about fighting for a better policy, it was about fighting for a better America. And in that fight, Sanders wasn't alone. This isn't just my fight, he said, pausing for emphasis. This is our fight. All of us. Every worker, every mother, every teacher, every young person dreaming of a better future. If we come together, if we demand what is right, we can build the America we deserve, a country where no one is left behind, where dignity, justice, and equality aren't just ideals but the foundation of everything we do. The room erupted in applause, but Sanders didn't flinch. He knew the battle wasn't over. He knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But the momentum was on his side. The people, tired of being ignored, tired of the slow, incremental changes that had never delivered, were ready to join him. They were ready to take a stand. For too long, he said, his voice steady with conviction, we've been told that change is impossible, that the system can't be fixed, that the powerful are too strong. But I know better. We all know better. The truth is, change is not just possible, it's inevitable. And together, we will make it happen. Because we're not just fighting for a better future, we're fighting for the soul of this nation. As he stepped away from the podium, the applause thundered through the room, a powerful affirmation of what Sanders had just said. The future was uncertain, the path ahead still rocky, but the moral clarity was clear. Change was coming, and it was coming from the people who refused to accept the way things had always been. Sanders had shown the country what true leadership looked like, not the kind that made deals to protect the powerful, but the kind that had the courage to take on the system, to fight for the most vulnerable, and to believe in a better future for all. And with that, he had delivered not just a speech, but a movement. The future was in their hands now. And nothing would stop them from making it a reality. The clash between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden wasn't just a battle of policy, it was a battle for America's future. In one corner stood Biden, the establishment figure, defending a broken system that has kept the powerful in control for decades. In the other, Bernie Sanders, an uncompromising force of change, fighting for a future where healthcare, education, and economic justice are rights, not privileges. The question now is clear: who will lead America toward the future it deserves? Will it be the cautious path of compromise, or the bold steps toward real transformation? The debate has left no room for doubt. Bernie Sanders' vision of radical, systemic change has struck a chord with millions who are tired of the slow, ineffective solutions that have failed them for too long. The future is calling for leaders who will act boldly, leaders who will fight for the people, not the corporate elites. This fight isn't over. It's just beginning. And you have a choice to make. Do you stand with those who want to maintain the status quo, or do you stand with the vision of a fairer, more just America? If you believe in the future Bernie Sanders is fighting for, a future where dignity, justice, and equality aren't just words but realities, then it's time to take action. It's time to be part of the movement. Hit that subscribe button, share this video, and join the fight for a better future. The change we need isn't coming from Washington, it's coming from the people. And together, we can make it happen. This fight is far from over, and the future belongs to those brave enough to demand it.